Good morning and welcome to another stormy day in Vermont. It's winter still with us, and the storm is not just happening outside the door here, the storm is also happening in public education. We have concerns both in terms of proposals for what might happen on the state level and now what might be coming down from the federal level. So my guest today is Steph Yu, who's been with the Public Assets Institute for 8 years. If you haven't seen her primer on education finance, how it now exists, I think it's one of the best clear explanations of how education finance currently works in the state. And I also just looked at an interview she did on YouTube with regard to an annual report done by the Public Assets Institute and how we're doing. And I recommend that as well. Stephanie came to Vermont and Public Asset Institute in 2015 and became the executive director in 2023. She's happy to be back in her New England roots after stints in the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and on the West Coast. At Public Assets Institute, she works making Vermont's unique education funding system, the state budget, and family economic policies more equitable and responsive to the needs of Vermonters. Her fiscal experience in the public and private sectors in multiple states informs that work, including staff time and AmeriCorps programs, state budget offices, and state legislatures. Welcome, Steph. It is delightful to have you here and bring your expertise to help Vermonters understand what's going on.
Thanks for having me.
So the overall theme of this show is with public education. Where are we now? Where do we want to go? How are we going to get there? And how are we going to pay for it? So you have some wonderful perspective on these issues, so why don't you start us out?
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I think a lot of the conversation right now was sort of driven by a lot of the changes in FY25, sort of this last year's budget. But a lot of these things have been going on for longer than that, right? I think there's been a lot of, there's been years of pretty significant changes, maybe over the last decade, efforts at consolidation, changes to pupil weights, changes to special education funding, all kinds of things. But I think what we've been trying to do is sort of separate out the conversation from how we pay for things and what's fair and unfair and where there's areas for improvement on how we pay for things versus sort of where the conversation I think is now in a lot of places, which is, are we spending the right amount? How much more should we spend? How much less should we spend? And sort of focus on that. But we tend to focus primarily on how we pay for it and really think about the fairest ways to do that.
Yeah, I was particularly struck in your presentation on education funding that these cliffs that we have, the 47,000 and the 90,000 in particular cliffs, and I often argued when I was in the legislature that cliffs are ridiculous in state funding. It automatically dooms whatever that is to some terrible end. Mm-hmm. And I think we're there with both of those cliffs right now.
Yeah, so I think it's worth noting that the 47,000 that you mentioned, that hasn't been changed since at least 1985. And the 90,000 cliff hasn't changed in 17 years, 18 years, 2008. Yeah. So what that means is many more Vermonters and Vermont households are falling over those cliffs, which means they're paying both an income share and a property share. And so that middle class band, that sort of moderate and middle class band is really paying the larger share of their income in school taxes, larger than higher income people.
Yeah.
And that's one of the inequities, I think, in the current system.
Right, and then you add in something that happened recently, I think, is the student weighting. Mm-hmm. I think, and you probably understand this better than I do, we saw in the last tax cycle, this current tax cycle, that some communities had little or no tax increase percentage-wise, while other communities saw as much as a 30% increase. And I believe, and please enlighten me, that a lot of that has to do with the weighting study, that these large tax increases had to do with low poverty rates in those communities.
So I think it's worth kind of breaking down what all went on in FY25. I think the single biggest driver in FY25 was there was a big increase in education spending. There was, in fact, a big increase in education spending. And that was, the Agency of Education identified 4 main drivers, right? It was the cost of healthcare for teachers. It was increased demand for mental health care services for kids. It was other inflationary pressures on, whatever, cleaning supplies, other things that schools need. And then the last area was the loss of the COVID era federal ESSER funds that were helping districts out for a number of years. So some of this was just that when that federal money went away, more of those costs fell on education spending. So across the state, we really saw those cost drivers affect pretty much every district, and so driving up spending somewhat. I think what you're talking about is sort of these disparities from town to town, part of which was driven by the weights, and part of which is a lot of that disconnect is because of the property tax piece of the school tax system, right? School taxes, people can pay based on income or pay based on property, but many end up in these cliffs where they pay based on both, and that's the challenge. And I think the property tax piece is where people see a disconnect or feel a disconnect because your property value doesn't say anything about your ability to pay. And in fact, in Vermont this last year, Vermont's property values grew faster than any other state between 24 and 25. So much of it had to do with the differences in property values from one town to the next. So if you're in a town where either you had a reappraisal or your property values went up more than the state average, you would see sort of a double whammy on your tax bill.
Yeah. And we saw a big influx of people due to COVID and due to the fires in the West Coast, and so our population grew pretty significantly, I think, in the last decade.
Yeah, so since 2020, we've, what we say is it's about 7,000 net people, but we just released actually a new report on migration based on taxpayers. So I think there's a couple different ways to look at it. The census tracks sort of all population changes, so that includes births, deaths, plus migration in and out of the state. And then the IRS is sort of a subset of that because they're just looking at if you're filing your taxes in a place different than where you filed them last year, they count you as having migrated. That could be a different state or a different country. But with all that, we are seeing sort of net positive to Vermont, again, especially for the last few years since the pandemic, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
For sure.
So let's see, where do we go from there? We're sort of in this situation where there's been a lot of shock and awe about taxes and sort of desire to do a better job. And so then the governor has, unlike the last decade, the governor came out with a plan for where he would like to see education go. I think it's remarkable to me, one of the first things I learned is these 5 school districts he proposed have the same geography as the OEO cap districts.
Mm-hmm.
So he's putting poverty districts in with school districts. Is that because he foresees more poverty and these districts are going to have to address poverty at a greater level? I wonder about the geography. I also, what is recently this week come up is the next step is he's introduced statewide school choice and vouchers. And I think the 5 districts, he's sort of painted himself into a corner, either deliberately or inadvertently. Each one of these districts has voucher schools, towns within those districts. So somehow or other, I don't think it's legal or possible for, like in our district, Lincoln is a voucher town. It's impossible for Lincoln to rejoin our district and still have vouchers, I think. So someone, either the school boards of the various 5 districts or the governor, is going to have to say everybody gets vouchers or nobody gets vouchers.
Right. I think that's definitely one of the concerns going to the 5 districts, which is, one, they're not all the same size, and they're certainly very different. There's some pretty significant regional differences and lots of other things. So that's one piece. I think, to your point, I think that this, there's definitely been a move toward greater use of vouchers, greater use of choice, greater use, and part of that is I think this administration has made no secret of its support for independent schools and for more choice rather than less, and that however the governance structure works within the districts, it definitely seems like the fewer districts, the broader choice gets. I think there's also something happening with choice because of the Carson v. Macon case at the U.S. Supreme Court, which essentially said if you have sort of a choice or a voucher system that includes any private schools, you can't exclude religious schools from that. So we're already sort of seeing the expansion of choice, right? So in terms of the types of school people can go to, that's already expanding. And I think if we don't do anything, it will sort of gradually expand anyway. And under the governor's plan, it seems like it's likely to accelerate, increased use of choice and vouchers.
Yeah. One of the things that concerns me fundamentally about the 5 districts is that while they took bits and pieces from 3 consultant firms, I think, to put this plan together, one of the things that they seemed to ignore was the optimum school district size is 3,900 students, roughly 4,000 students. And all of the 5 districts exceed that. And this district, the one that you and I are both in, is almost 10 times greater than what is so-called the optimal district.
Right. Yeah, I think that point is well taken in terms of there's a wide range of what the districts are. I know there's a lot of thinking about what is the right size for a district, and there are things that are certainly unique about Vermont. Maybe not all the things we tell ourselves are unique or exceptional about Vermont, but how does that play out in a more rural district? We certainly don't want to be busing elementary school kids. I think a lot of people are thinking about it differently at the different levels of school, right? How can you combine districts in a way where you still have elementary schools close by for kids, they're not on the bus for a long time, where you might want bigger high schools coming together, bringing a lot of kids together from a lot of different towns, because that does give them the ability to have sort of more opportunities, more different kinds of classes, more extracurriculars, all that stuff. So I think there's also a distinction we have to make depending on the level of the school, whether it's elementary or high too.
Yes, one of the guests that I've had here has been Bill Schubart, and you're probably familiar with some of his work. Sure. He said something in that interview that really struck me and stuck with me, was that infants and toddlers should be as close to home as possible, and that then when you start getting into the elementary school level, to have those in a community at the community level is important, not just for the community, but also so kids are close to home and mom can come or dad, and if you have a child sick or grandparent or whatever, and help out and take care of the child. And then as you move into high school, kids have cars and the ability to offer programs, AP Calc and Auto Tech and construction, the ability to offer these kinds of variety of programs. Really, it's important to have a greater number of pupils coming to your school, and they can travel further without hardship. Yeah. To attend those schools. That notion really stuck with me, yet I don't see that in the governor's proposal. What he has put forward is suggestions for staff to pupil ratios that are concerning, I think.
Yeah. And to that point, I think so this isn't new. Some of these pieces aren't new, right? Over the governor's tenure, there's been a proposal for a single statewide school district. There's definitely been pushes toward adjusting the ratios quite a bit over the years. So those parts are not necessarily new, sort of fewer districts and lower student-teacher ratios, or higher student-teacher ratios,
yeah.
Teacher-student. But the point is that I think a lot of these questions, there's a lot of room between sort of where we are and where we want to be, and I think it's worth thinking about. Yeah, what are the goals? I think we want to start from a place, but in any of this conversation, what worries me is when we start from a place where all we're doing is talking about the taxes and not about what kids need, then that drives a different conversation than when we're really talking about what's best for kids. But we know school budgets costs are primarily teachers, personnel, right? So it's if we're making cuts, we're saving money, we're talking about classroom teachers. And so I think when you talk to parents and you talk to teachers, the sense is certainly not that schools have plenty of money, but probably that they could use more resources.
Yeah, and the governor's proposal is to reduce spending by $175 million. Now, I did a little back of the envelope calculation. That's like 1,400 or 1,500 teachers.
Yeah.
That's at the 80% level, figuring that 20% is going to be administration and buildings and whatever, where you're going to save money. 1,400 or 1,500 teachers statewide. That's a lot of teachers, and that's a lot of resources for children, it seems to me.
Yep, I agree with that. And I think, a lot of the conversation has been around saying that schools can do more with less, right? I think that's the promise we keep hearing, is that they can do more with less, that we're not talking about giving up anything on the school front. We can have just as good schools, but we're going to do it for less money. I always think there's always places where we can look. We want to make sure we're spending our money wisely. There's always, there's a lot of talk about making some changes to the teachers' healthcare system, not in the way that would cut benefits for teachers, but in a way that might actually save money that other states have done. So we can look for those areas. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I think classroom teachers and are sort of the last place we should be talking about cutting.
Yeah. So we're not actually the most expensive on a per pupil basis spending in the country. I think the numbers that the Agency of Education put forward in her Listen and Learn tour, which I'm not sure was much of either listening or learning, frankly, was that we were 5th in the nation. So are you familiar with any of those other states and how they spend money, and can we learn something from that?
So there's a couple things. So I want to just kind of start with this idea that that's one measure, right? And I don't think, again, that's the most important measure. I think it's more important to ask the questions of whether kids in Vermont are getting what they need. But we've always been high on those lists for decades. As long as they've been keeping those lists, we've sort of been on the higher side of that. And there's also a regional difference. A lot of it is the Northeast states tend to spend more on schools. So we've been up there alongside our neighbors. That's been true for as long as they've been keeping those numbers. I also want to just sort of inject a little bit of a note of caution into those numbers because Vermont has a unique funding system, as you know, and it's a statewide system. It's not always apples to oranges. We don't know sort of what social services get included in other states and what don't. There's often ins and outs over the years, so it's not always that easy to capture. But I will point out that adjusted for inflation, education spending has been flat for 2 decades.
Oh.
So it's about the same as the state budget. That's pretty much true of the rest of the state budget. It's all flat. I have a chart for this if you all would like to see it. But it's been flat, and even on a per pupil basis, adjusted for inflation, it grows about 1% a year. So I think people really don't have a good sense of sort of the context of those numbers, right? They hear that one number, we're a high spender, and that sort of raises alarm bells. But I think there's more context there. The other thing I'll say is that all of those cost drivers that I mentioned earlier, the big 4 that sort of drove the big increase in FY25, those are hitting other states too. So we actually are kind of the middle of the pack in terms of how much growth we've had in the last few years, right? A lot of states' education spending has actually grown faster than ours over the last couple of years because everybody's having these problems. The cost of healthcare is going up everywhere, the cost of housing, inflation, all of these things are hurting all states.
Yeah. So what are we going to do?
Good question. Good question. I mean, I think a lot of the question that I keep coming back to is I want to recognize the fact that our schools are the backstop for anything we're not doing sort of in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So they're dealing with the problems of poverty, they're dealing with the hangover of the pandemic, they're dealing with the mental health care stuff that's not getting funded in other places. So the schools are sort of this catch-all for the problems we're underfunding in other places. So I think it's worth sort of asking that question. I mean, that's another question I think that's been coming up in the legislature and in the Montpelier conversation quite a bit is what belongs in the education fund and what doesn't. And I think for a long time, people have thought that things are safer if they're in the education fund, so they want to keep them there and worry that they would get cut in the general fund. But I think we also should acknowledge that things that are sort of supporting kids in poverty, universal school meals, mental health care, we got to guarantee that stuff. No matter which pot we fund it out of, we got to make sure that it's getting paid for.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to legislators in terms of, I think there are some issues in education, our test scores, and I'm reluctant to bring them up, but I'm going to anyway, because everybody measures, not everybody, most people measure success of schools by test scores, and ours have not been keeping up, so to speak. I think that the effort around changing the weights in students was really well intentioned. Unfortunately, several school districts did not use the weighting to deliver extra resources to low-income kids. So that while the intention was there, the result was not always there. So the notion of trying to find a way to send more resources towards low-income kids and English language learners and special ed costs, those are all valid concerns, I think, about where we move today to where we want to be. What advice would you give the legislature?
I think my advice is to narrow the problems. Like, let's take the problems a little bit apart instead of sort of looking at this whole, like, feeling that the whole system needs transformation and we need to make these major changes. So, we've been talking about these cliffs. The one piece is fix the inequities in who pays in the tax system side so that people have a cleaner conversation about what kids need, and it's not because they're getting a tax bill that they can't afford that's causing them to kind of either not support their schools or send their school boards back to the drawing board. So I think that's one chunk of the problem. I think another chunk is to really, again, sort of have some of these big picture conversations about what social services are in the ed fund and what's not. Certainly we need to make sure that mental health care for kids is funded. I was going to say something on the pupil weighting piece. To your point, it was about taxing capacity, and I think you're right that we can't say that it worked in the sense that districts necessarily got a lot more resources to kids in these categories. But the reality is we haven't even let it play out. Because there were these confounding factors in FY25, we don't actually know if the districts with more weighted kids would have behaved differently if we hadn't had these other cost pressures. So, we were supportive of kind of doing it a different way. I don't know if you how engaged you were in that conversation, but we were hesitant about the weights for that very reason. Because a town could split the difference, maybe put a little more resources, or maybe take the tax break. Because the weights really change your taxing capacity, but they don't guarantee money going into these areas. And so we were sort of thinking about how you get more money going into these areas. So I think it's worth sort of more narrowly defining the problem of what we're calling I think people are conflating low spending districts with districts who aren't spending enough for kids in these categories, right? For kids who particularly need more support to succeed in school. So I think we want to sort of separate out those pieces. Are we just talking about outcomes? Or is it the outcomes that we're basing on whether you need more resources or not? Is it whether you're one of the low spenders? Because we did a bunch of analysis on this recently and found that most towns are not consistently high spending or consistently low spending. When you look at the bottom 25 spenders, they're not the same year after year. It's usually people are on that list for a year at a time and then they pop back up. Same with the high spenders. They're not consistently high spenders. We all know there's sort of like a town or two that we think of like as being a consistently low spender. So there's a couple, but most towns aren't in that boat. Most towns are pretty close to the average. So I think it's sort of we need a better definition of who needs more resources and how to get them there. If it's the kids in the weighted categories, then let's either give the weights more of a chance to work, or let's talk about directing more resources through categorical aid or something like that. Or if we're focused on the outcomes, then let's talk about what are the resources needed to address those outcomes. The governor's plan is a pretty blunt instrument, to kind of a foundation system which would also force down any district from spending above that amount, or allow a lot of disparity if they don't force those higher spenders down. So those are sort of the two. So it feels like a pretty blunt response. If your issue is that there's a handful of districts that really need more resources, I don't think you have to change the whole system.
So you touched on categorical aid. Another thing that's happening in current events is that I think that we have some reasonable concern that we may lose federal funding, Title I, Title IX, special education, and other forms of federal aid for our school system. Do you have any inclination of what that might be and what we might do about it?
Yeah, so to that point, most of our school funding is paid for with state dollars, but the pots of federal dollars are very targeted, so they're really critical to some of these populations, right? So there's, to your point, there's money for special ed, there's money for multilingual learners, there's money for poverty, there's also the reimbursement program for some of the meals programs and all those things. So they're very targeted and they're very important in those target areas. So I think there's a lot of concern about what might be coming down in terms of the feds. It's not just, and it's also, what are the regulations, right? The reason that there's special ed dollars and the reasons that there's some of these dollars for ELL and multilingual learners is because there's requirements to provide services to those kids. So if those requirements go away, then what happens? I also, I have to say that we're looking even more broadly across the state budget and recognizing that there could be federal cuts in a whole lot of places, which are also going to have ripple effects on our
mental
kids.
health.
Mental health is one.
Yeah.
Certainly 3 squares, some of the food programs, some of the, the reach up dollars that help. I think we're all bracing for what that might mean and what we might be able to do about it at the state level.
So what I'm hearing and is that now is not the time to make drastic changes to a system that fundamentally works pretty well. That we do need to make some targeted or some nuances, such as the cliffs in financing. And I looked a little bit at the public assets / NEA proposal for moving to income-based funding of school. There's been a lot of people that think that would be a better, fairer way to go. Is that what you feel and the public assets study is showing?
So I appreciate you summarizing, because I think I kind of rambled in that last list, but I think that's right. I think you can fix the cliffs right away. So you could fix the cliffs going into FY26, save lower tax bills for 50,000 Vermont households just by updating those thresholds that haven't been updated in 40 years. That would make a huge difference. Then I think you do go to income-based taxes, and we've spent a lot of time on this, thinking about it, working on it, and just want to acknowledge that, we know that the higher income people don't qualify for income sensitivity. They pay based on property. So they pay a lower share of their income in school taxes than the low and middle income people. And that, to our mind, that's just the definition of an unfair system. That shouldn't be what it looks like. And I think it's also kind of worth thinking about the history of property taxes. Many public schools in many states, as you know, are paid for by property taxes. And a lot of that is because they were put in place before most people had outside jobs, right? Before income was as much of a thing, and most people weren't getting most of their resources from an employer or a job. And property was the only measure of ability to pay or measure of wealth. So that's changed so much that I think it's worth sort of our systems catching up to that and going to income. And we think it would be a much fairer system. And I think it would be a lot simpler to understand, because to your point about what all the confusion that went on this year, all of that was driven by the property tax piece of it. The disconnect, the confusion about how much it changed in one town versus another town, the cliffs problems, all of these are related to the property piece of the school tax system, not the income piece. Yeah.
I had a thought that just flipped out of my brain.
I know the feeling.
With regard to moving to an income-based system, that one of the areas, looking at our tax system overall in the state and in the nation, for that matter, we miss the wealth, taxing the wealth in this country and in this state. In particular, I think the capital gains that people have, it struck me that, if you have a savings account in a bank, the money you earn there is taxed as regular income. But if you have it in stocks and bonds, then it's taxed at a capital gains rate, either short-term or long-term, which is lower than income. So here we are giving a benefit to people who have, big investment in stock, while your, regular family in town is not able to take advantage of that and is taxed pretty much on every penny they earn.
Yep, good point. I agree. And I think, so part of the proposals that have been, one thing that's been in the mix of these proposals that the legislature is considering is, I think there is this question of, income's the best measure of ability to pay, but it's not perfect because it doesn't necessarily tell you a whole lot about someone's net worth. The Tax Structure Commission, which was working from like 2019 to 2021, did a lot of work on education taxes, and they really wanted to look at whether the value of your primary residence, right, which is what school taxes are based on, the value of your primary residence was connected to your net worth. And what they found was, at the low end, it wasn't a good indicator of your net worth because most people had a mortgage. So even if that value was growing, if you still owed a significant amount, then it wasn't necessarily an indication of your wealth. And in fact, it's less true now, but in the early years after the Great Recession, many people were even underwater. So it was actually a net negative in terms of their net worth, right? And then at the high end, your primary residence is such a small piece of your net worth that it's also not a good indicator. And to your point, for most people in the middle, it's the biggest asset that you have, right? And so I think it's kind of worth acknowledging. We would there was a bill on wealth taxes in the House that was particularly trying to get at some of that stocks and bonds and unrealized capital gains. But the primary, and so we should be looking at people's net worth. There's a conversation around having some sort of asset declaration so that as a state we could move toward a better understanding of someone's whole financial picture and not just rely on what the two measures we have, which is income and primary residence, neither of which is perfect. But I will say, so I think we're in favor of sort of gathering more information and moving to wealth taxes, because I think we know income inequality, wealth inequality keeps compounding, keeps increasing. And so what we know we're not capturing all that wealth, and we know that sort of, again, it's accruing to a very small group of people. And so, I think we do want a better sense of people's net worth, and that's important. But without having that information, and as we move to collect better information in that regard, income is the best measure we have. And so we know all these high income people are paying less than the low and moderate income people. We can fix that.
Yeah. Well, I think we have some solutions for the legislature to delve into, and I hope they watch this, and I hope the public is able to learn and access the information that Public Assets Institute and your work has contributed to our state. I want to thank you so much for coming today and sharing your knowledge. And I may ask you back as we get deeper and deeper into this education funding or change that we're contemplating at the state level. Thank you so much.
Happy to do it, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for being here.